Hello, Nice Community Church. It's great to be with you again online. Getting quite used to doing these little videos. I never thought I'd see myself making videos and sharing them online, but sure, here, this is where we are and this is how it is. But may God keep us, because it's a very difficult time for us all. All we want to do is just to be together. All we want to do is just be in that place where we're worshipping together, seeing one another, knowing and loving one another. And it's difficult because here we are restricted, cut off, and all of us in our own homes. But I just pray that God will keep you and me, each one of us, under his wings during this time, and giving us the grace just to persevere and cope with our current reality of just being restricted in our own homes. I've got a short message for you today. It's following on from during the week I shared a message from John chapter 21, and I'm still in that chapter and would like to just follow on with some of the thoughts that I had previously shared with you. John chapter 21 is the last chapter of John's Gospel. We find that Jesus has died, been crucified, and he is now resurrected. And the story is about some of his disciples. They decide to go fishing. They're in the boat and Jesus shows up, and he speaks to them, and he prepares some food on the shore, and they have some interaction with him. And so I'm going to read from John chapter 21, and I'm going to read down to verse 10, and it reads like this. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. I am going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out, got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you caught any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have caught. And that's a story that you may already know, you may already be familiar with. During the week I shared some thoughts on some of this story, and today's message is a very simple message in a sense. There's just 2 points that I'd like to make. The first thing that I notice about this particular story is found in the opening verses. It's verse 3, and it is the words of Peter, and he says some simple words that have a very deep impact, really, not only upon himself but on the others that were with him that day. And he says these words. He says, I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we will go with you. So they went out, got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Peter says these words, I'm going out to fish. Here we find Peter, I think, at this time in his life, that he is unsettled, that he is maybe a little bit disillusioned, maybe even discouraged because of recent events. His Lord and his Master, Jesus, was crucified, and he witnessed that, and one can only imagine that it must have been very difficult for Peter during this particular time. Not only Peter, the others, the disciples, and the others that knew Jesus. But Peter says these words, I'm going out to fish. You may remember that when Jesus met Peter for the very first time in Luke chapter 5, Peter, he was a fisherman. He was in his boat, and he couldn't catch any fish, and Jesus had some interaction with him and told him to place his nets out, and when he did, he caught some fish. And from that story in Luke chapter 5, Jesus turns to Peter and he says these words. He says, from now on you will be a fisher of men. And he speaks to Peter about the plans that he has for Peter's life, and those plans were to be in the ministry, in that sense, to follow Jesus and to fish for souls, that is, to bring people into the kingdom of God. And so from that time in Peter's life, he lays down the fishing industry, his career, his job, his work of being a fisherman, and he then signs up and to follow Jesus and to enter into a new life, a new path, a new lifestyle, which is watching Jesus, being with Jesus, learning from him, witnessing everything that he's doing. But he leaves the fishing industry behind, and there are many people who can identify and understand this, is that in their life, they when they come to Christ for the very first time and they begin to have a relationship with him, for many people they turn away from an aspect of their life in some way. For some, they leave behind, or they say goodbye to areas of their life. And so for some, it's a particular work or a particular career. They give it up. They say, here, look, this is not a part of my life anymore because I've got a new path. I'm on a new journey. I'm going in a different and a new direction. And so they lay this aspect of their life down. They say goodbye to it. They say, here, this is not a part of my life anymore because I'm now following Christ in a new direction. And this happened to Peter in terms of his career as a fisherman. He laid that down. He said goodbye to that, and he said yes to this new life, which was a life following Jesus and a life learning from him. And so when we read in John chapter 21, we read these words, I'm going out to fish. And really what's happening here is Peter is now returning to the very activity that he had moved on from. He's now returning back to that place that he had left so many years ago. And he is returning to something that he had not been a part of for some time. And I think he says this and he does this because he is seeking comfort. It's an uncomfortable time for the disciples. It's an uncomfortable and an unsettling time for Peter. He is most probably disillusioned, discouraged, and trying to make sense of recent events. And so out of that and in that, he is seeking some kind of comfort for himself. And so he thinks to himself, well, I know what I'll do. I'll go back to what I know. I'll go back to what I used to do, because when I'm in that place, I'm comfortable. I know where I am, and this will help me. And so he says, I'm going out to fish. And I think that's very true in the lives of God's people, that sometimes we have something in our lives and we lay it down, we say goodbye to it, we say this is not a part of my life anymore because I'm now following Christ, I'm now on a new direction, on a new path, and so I'm saying goodbye to fishing, I'm saying goodbye to this area of my life, because this is not a part of my life now. And when things get tough, or when we are upset or unsettled, when we are maybe disillusioned or discouraged, we may ask ourselves, what is it that we return to, or where is it that we go when we are in that place within our lives and in our hearts? Do we return back, like Peter, to the very things that we have said goodbye to? And this is what Peter does. He says, I'm going out to fish. The other thing that caught my attention about this was that when he said those words, it may be the case that he intended that just to be what he was doing. He was just communicating, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm going out to fish. I don't know about you. I don't know what you're going to do. I don't know what your plans or your intentions are. But for me, this is what I'm doing. And I don't know if he fully realized that the rest of the disciples would actually agree with him and say, well, we're going with you. Wherever you're going, that's where we're going too. And that's exactly what happened. Verse 3 says, I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out, got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And so here we have Peter. He wants comfort. He wants to be at peace. He's looking for some kind of place in his life where he can find peace. And his strategy is to return to the very thing that he said that he was giving up, and he goes back to that place of fishing. And whether he knew it or knew it not, but he now is leading others into that same place. His words have such an effect on the other disciples that they decide to follow him. And maybe this was not his intention, I don't know, but the reality is that Peter now is leading others into a place where he's trying to find comfort for himself, and they all follow him. And it teaches me about the power of words and the things we say. Peter says something so simple, not very offensive. He says, I'm going out to fish. He may have intended it for his own life, but the reality is that his words actually have an effect upon the lives of the other disciples. His words have some power in the sense that he now gives them an opportunity to follow him. And so here they all are, literally in the same boat. And I can just picture Peter and the other disciples. There's a number of them, maybe 6 or 7 of them, all together. And here they are, all together in one boat. And can you just imagine that boat full of the disciples on the waves, and the waves are rocking, and the boat is rocking, and here they all are in the same boat, and their boat is being rocked. And I think their boat has been rocked in terms of recent events concerning the Lord and his death and resurrection. But I also think that in their lives, in their own personal and individual lives, their boat is being rocked. And I think that's very true for many of us today. We can all identify that there are times in our lives where our boat, that is our life, is being rocked. We're on the waves of something, the waves of disappointment, the waves of disillusionment, the waves of uncertainty, and our boat is being rocked. And here the disciples are. Here is Peter and Nathaniel and some others, and their boat is on the waves, and their boat is being rocked. And it's all because one man says these simple words: I'm going out to fish. How is your boat? Is the boat of your life being rocked on the waves of something today? Have you, like Peter, decided to return to something that you have previously given up? Are you now returning to find some comfort, find some certainty in something that you have previously laid down? That was Peter's life. He simply says, I'm going out to fish. And the fishing was something that he had given up. The story goes that in verse 4 it says this: early in the morning Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. I think this is true, and I share these thoughts during the week, is that there are times in the life of the disciples here that Jesus is standing on the shores, and they didn't realize it was Jesus. They didn't know for sure that it was him. And I think that's so true in our lives too, that there are times when we are unsettled, times when life is difficult, we may be upset, we are wondering how the future will unfold. We think about how we are now, and we wonder to ourselves, what will it be like? And all we want is peace. All we want is a bit of clarity, and to be back into that place where we are full of faith and full of assurance. And yet here we find the disciples all together in one boat, and that boat is rocking on the waves of the waters. And Jesus is standing on the shores. He sees them, he knows them, he's watching them. And I think that's true in our lives too, that there are times in our lives when Jesus is standing on the shores of our lives. He is present. We may not realize it, we may not even recognize him, but that does not mean that he is not present. And can I assure you today that in this time of uncertainty, in this time when it may feel that our lives, where we are all together in one boat, and that our boat is rocking on the waves of current circumstances, can I assure you that Jesus stands upon the shores of our lives, that he loves us, that he sees us, that he knows us, and even if we do not recognize him, even if we do not see him in the way that we are familiar with, that he is standing on the shores. In verse 7 it says this: then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off. He jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals, there were fish on it, and some bread. And two little things in those sentences that struck my heart. Number one was that Peter jumps out of the boat and he jumps into the water. And so you can just imagine him, can't you? You can just visualize the picture. Peter, he recognizes now that it's the Lord, because one of the other disciples has says this, and he jumps out of the boat in a rush, in such determination, because he wants to get to Jesus, and he now jumps into the water. And sure, here when you jump into the water you're going to get wet, and I can picture this young man Peter. He is wet, he is saturated. And have you ever been in a pool of water, or in a river, or in waters of some kind, maybe even at the sea? Have you ever tried to run in the water? It's a very difficult thing to do, because normally what happens is we become saturated, we become soaked by the waters, that it makes it very difficult. There is a lot of splashing around, and I can visualize Peter just running and trying to run and making a big splash because he wants to get to Jesus. And he is saturated, he is soaked. And when you are saturated and when you are soaked, your clothes feel a lot heavier, don't they? Have you ever been saturated and soaked by an outpouring of rain, and you come in and you're walking, but the weight of your clothes, because they are wetter, they're heavy? And isn't it like that sometimes? Isn't it like that in some seasons of our lives where we may feel saturated or soaked through, that we feel heavy, that we cannot walk in the way that we want to walk? We're making a splash, we have a determination in our hearts, but it's just a little bit more difficult to get to Jesus. And maybe it was like that for Simon Peter when he jumped into the water. The other thing that I noticed about these verses was when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals with some fish on it and some bread. And that's just a lovely picture. Here you have the disciples and Peter, and Jesus is on the shore. He has lit a fire. It's almost like there is a barbecue ready and waiting for them. And they see this fire and they approach Jesus. They go towards him. And I can just picture Peter and the others just with Jesus around the fire. And here they all are, wet, saturated, soaked, and they begin to warm themselves at Jesus' fire that he has lit. And I remember growing up in inner city Dublin, my mum, we had an open fire in the house that we lived in, and even we had moved from the inner city Dublin to Ballyfermot, and even in that house we had an open fire. And every day my mum would light the fire, and she would put coal and logs on this open fire, and this fire would be blazing. The house would be just so warmed because of the fire that she would light. And I did what many people do, is at an open fire I would stand with my hands to the fire, and I would warm my hands, and I would get myself lovely and warm. And sometimes I would turn my back to the fire and just stand, and I could feel the heat of the fire just warming me and warming my clothes, to such a point where it would warm my jeans or my trousers, where it would be difficult to warm because it would be difficult to walk because they would be so warm. And have you ever done that? Have you ever just stood at a fire, warming yourself, warming your hands, knowing the warmth of the fire that is blazing, that is burning, and you just knowing the warmth that comes from that? Jesus has lit a fire. He's on the shores. The disciples are there. He's there. And here I can see them just warming themselves at the fire, gazing at the fire that he has lit as he prepares some food for them. I think this is the place where they want to be. I think this is the place where we all want to be, is in this place, in the place where we are present with him, in the place where we are knowing the warmth of his fire and the fire of God's love in our lives and in our hearts, and knowing the blaze of his presence and his spirit in our hearts and in our lives. And have you ever noticed in others that they may have a fire in their hearts, a passion, they are burning brightly for Jesus? And I think that is because they bring themselves to him. They make a determined step to get to him and into his presence. And through that process they have the warmth of God's love in their life. They have a burning passion that has been ignited in the presence of Jesus. And isn't it just beautiful to see that in somebody's life? I think that for the disciples and for you and me, that there is no better place to be than to be in the presence of Jesus, and knowing the fire that he burns and that he ignites, that we know the warmth of that in our lives, that we find ourselves warming ourselves from his fire rather than the fire of other people. And when I read this story, I see that this is the place for God's people, to be on the shores and in the presence of Jesus, to be warming themselves and knowing the warmth of the fire that Jesus lights, because there is no better fire, there is no better blaze that can ignite something within our own hearts and our own devotion. And so this is a simple message, and there's two things that I want to leave with you. Number one, Peter said this. He says, I'm going fishing. Are you, during these unsettling times, can you identify with Peter? Have you found yourself returning to something that you had previously given up because you're seeking comfort and you're seeking clarity? And may I invite you that if you feel that your boat is being rocked during this particular season, to do what Peter did, is get out of the boat. To do what the other disciples did, is get out of the boat and make your way towards Jesus on the shores, because it is in that place where of what he has prepared for us, and that we warm ourselves with his fire, that we would know the blaze of it in our lives, the blaze of God's love in our life, the blaze of God's Spirit in our lives. And that's the place for you and me, is to be in his presence, seeing him, knowing the warmth of his presence, and knowing the goodness of him in our lives. And so this morning, I want to encourage you, make your way, get out of the boat and make your way towards Jesus, because he has something that is prepared for you. And when you get into his presence, you'll find yourself being reignited with a blaze and with a fire in your own heart, where you know the warmth of God's love, you know the blaze of the fire that Jesus has lit, and sure, there's no better place. This is the place for you and me. And so during this particular time, if your boat is being rocking, or your life is unsettled in any way, get out of the boat and make your way to him, because he has something that is precious for you and prepared for you, just as we see it in this story. May God bless you, may God keep you, and may his face shine upon you and me, and may we know his peace, his grace in our lives during this particular season. Amen. God bless you.